This is the afternoon of the 5th of December. Clip put up by black box analysts. F-16 Thunderbird crash in California. What really happened? Let's have a listen to this clip. Plays for almost 10 minutes.
We have a Thunderbird F-16 down in California after a training flight went wrong. The pilot survived, but the big question now is what led to the ejection. This is William, and welcome to Black Box Analyst. The basic timeline is straightforward, even though the details are still developing. The aircraft involved was an F-16C assigned to the Thunderbird's demonstration team, operating out of Edwards Air Force Base. According to early reports, the pilot was performing a routine training flight in the area when something went wrong. At some point in the sequence, the pilot initiated a climb, likely to gain altitude, and then made the decision to eject. The jet continued on its own trajectory until impact, where it was destroyed. The pilot was recovered in stable condition. This initial climb is an important clue. When a pilot senses that an aircraft may become uncontrollable or is already showing signs of losing stability, the instinctive and trained response is to increase altitude. Altitude buys time, and time buys options. It allows a pilot to troubleshoot, assess the scope of the issue, and, if necessary, separate from the aircraft safely. So the fact that this climb appears in the timeline suggests the pilot recognized something was wrong early enough to set up a safer ejection window. It also suggests the issue was not an immediate catastrophic failure, like an explosion, a mid-air breakup, or a complete blackout. Instead, whatever happened was dynamic, progressive, and concerning enough that the pilot did not believe the aircraft could be recovered. Another important point is location. Edwards Air Force Base sits in a remote stretch of the Mojave Desert with plenty of controlled airspace. That environment reduces the risk to people on the ground if the aircraft becomes uncontrollable, but it also provides excellent radar coverage and telemetry support during test flights and training runs. That means investigators will likely have unusually strong data sources available, including radar returns, positional tracking, and possibly airborne video from other aircraft in the area. All of that will play a major role in understanding what happened in the final moments of the flight. Understanding this accident also requires a clear sense of what a Thunderbird sortie actually looks like. Thunderbird pilots fly the F-16 extremely close to its performance limits. They pull high G loads, execute rapid transitions, and work in tight formation spacing that leaves almost no room for distraction. Even in a routine training flight, these pilots are training their bodies to handle the acceleration forces, their muscles to anticipate rapid transitions, and their eyes to remain focused despite constantly shifting visual cues. A typical maneuver can take a pilot from heavy positive Gs into a quick roll or pitch change that requires instant control input. Beyond the physical demands, there is the complexity of formation flying. Thunderbird formations are incredibly tight, often just a few feet of wingtip separation. That means each pilot must maintain absolute precision, reacting not just to their own aircraft but to subtle changes in the lead aircraft's attitude and speed. It's a highly choreographed environment, and even a slight delay in response can snowball into a significant deviation. If something begins to feel off inside the jet, whether that's an unusual vibration, control stiffness, power fluctuations, or sensory overload, the pilot must decide how much deviation from the choreography is acceptable before breaking away for safety. The aircraft itself is also configured differently for demonstration work. While the airframe is still fundamentally an F-16C, the Thunderbirds use smoke generators, unique fuel and hydraulic routing to support those systems, and different weight distributions compared to a standard combat configuration. These modifications are safe and thoroughly tested, but they change how the aircraft handles during certain maneuvers. It's subtle, and Thunderbird pilots are trained extensively on it, but any mechanical or aerodynamic issue can present differently on a demonstration-configured F-16 than it would on a combat-configured one. Finally, there's the human factor. Thunderbird pilots are some of the most proficient aviators in the Air Force, but they are also pushing themselves physically and mentally on every flight. Hydration, G tolerance, muscle conditioning, and breathing technique are all part of the routine. A lapse in any of those areas can produce symptoms that feel like the onset of G-lock, spatial disorientation, or reduced situational awareness. The important thing to emphasize is that Thunderbird pilots are trained to recognize the very early signs of these issues. If the pilot in this case sensed even a hint that cognitive performance was slipping or that the aircraft was failing to respond as expected, that could be enough to justify an early climb and ejection. When an F-16 pilot climbs and ejects rather than attempt continued troubleshooting, it usually points to one of a few categories of issues. One possibility is a flight control anomaly. The F-16 relies heavily on its fly-by-wire system, which filters pilot inputs through the flight control computer to maintain stability. If the aircraft begins producing unexpected movements or fails to respond cleanly to inputs, especially during a high-performance profile, the pilot may interpret that as an early sign of potential loss of control. Another area investigators will look at is engine behavior. The F-16C uses the F-11O turbofan, which is extremely reliable, but any abnormal spool behavior, thrust fluctuations, or compressor issues could lead to an ejection decision if the aircraft cannot maintain stable power. A partial power loss at high altitude is manageable. A partial loss at low altitude during a maneuver sequence is an entirely different situation. If the aircraft wasn't climbing as expected or began settling unexpectedly, the pilot might have chosen to eject before losing too much altitude. Physiological factors also cannot be ruled out, even when there is no evidence at this stage pointing directly to them. High-G maneuvering can cause tunnel vision, graying out, or spatial disorientation. Even if the pilot never lost consciousness, the sensation of degraded awareness, combined with a jet behaving outside of expected parameters, would be a strong trigger to initiate a climb and prepare for ejection. Thunderbird pilots are trained to listen to those signals, because the cost of ignoring them can be fatal. The absence of an attempted recovery is significant, and F-16 pilots have several layers of emergency procedures for unusual attitudes, partial power, or instrument failures. The fact that the pilot did not attempt a prolonged recovery suggests the problem escalated quickly. It wasn't instantaneous, but it also wasn't stable enough to allow deliberate step-by-step checklists. That middle ground, rapidly deteriorating but not catastrophic, is often where early ejection decisions are made. This incident naturally brings to mind the 2018 Thunderbird crash involving Major Stephen Cafe Del Bagno. That earlier accident occurred during a high bomb burst rejoin maneuver and involved G-lock G-induced loss of consciousness. The aircraft struck the ground intact at high speed, and the pilot never had the opportunity to eject. The reason it's worth mentioning is not to draw direct parallels, because the situations appear very different, but to highlight the extreme physical environment Thunderbird pilots operate in. High G-forces, rapid transitions, and precise timing demand, physical conditioning, hydration, and mental focus. If anything disrupts that chain, even briefly, the results can be severe. In contrast, the California crash showed a very different pattern. The aircraft was in a climb. The pilot recognized the situation early enough to eject. The impact site was compact, and there were no signs of a sudden, uncontrollable departure close to the ground. The pilot remained conscious and alert, which is already a major distinction from G-lock cases. All of these early indicators point more toward a technical or controllability problem that the pilot had time to diagnose, or at least recognize, before taking action. As the investigation moves forward, the safety board will examine every major clue the aircraft and the environment can provide. They will analyze engine performance data from the F-11O, study whatever parameters the flight control computers manage to record, and review all maintenance records leading up to the flight. They will evaluate the pilot's physiological condition, recent G exposure, and workload during the maneuver sequence. Formation geometry will also be considered, along with any video from chase aircraft, ground cameras, or range instrumentation. Radar tracking data and the sequencing information from the ejection seat will help reconstruct the final seconds. In short, every component, hydraulic line, and electrical pathway will be inspected, because nothing is too minor to matter. There is another detail worth considering: the altitude at which the pilot chose to eject. If the pilot intentionally climbed before abandoning the aircraft, it suggests an early awareness that the jet might not be recoverable. Gaining altitude buys time to troubleshoot, time to turn away from populated areas, time to separate from other aircraft in the formation, and, most importantly, time to ensure a survivable ejection. And that becomes the key takeaway at this stage. The pilot recognized the developing emergency, made the decision at the correct moment, and survived. The aircraft can be replaced, the pilot cannot. Thanks for watching, and I'll keep you updated as more information becomes available.
The pilot's career is over. When you eject from a fighter, the shock of the ejection by the rockets in the seat compresses your spine, and he won't be allowed to fly again, not in a jet. Now, he might work for an airline, but he won't be able to fly with the Thunderbirds ever again. So the last thing they want to do is eject. And the only reason that they will eject is to save their own lives, which is what this pilot did. I'll attach the link. Look at it, pass it along, and thanks for listening.